Here's a question to start us off. How have you most changed in the last 5 years? Or 10 years? Or 20 years? Now, let's think about that for a second. How have you changed? A lot of us think this way. We think physically. That is not the same couple. I mean, it is, but it sure doesn't look like it, does it? That's us like 3 days after we were married, and this is 33 years after we were married, right? Like, so you can look at things and you can see, okay, goodness, we have changed. But a lot of us have changed in many, many other ways. And if you don't think you've changed, go to your spouse and say, how have I changed? And they will have a list this long of things that you've changed, and then they'll have a list this long of things they wished you would change that you haven't changed, right? We, all of us do that. So let me give you a little quiz here. What is the mission of Atlanta Road Alliance Church? Can anybody remember? That's right. Love God, love each other, love the world. And there's a piece that goes part of that. It's very good. See? Phyllis gets a gold star. Because we say we want to be a church where people can come as they are and what? Be changed. Right? We said this over and over. We want to be a church that invites people to come as they are to be changed. And we're going to come to what Phil said in a second. That's kind of the how we do that vision. But the key word in that entire statement that we do over and over and over and over, of we want people to feel invited, come as you are. Doesn't matter what you're like. One of the ways to say it is like this. It's okay to not be okay. It is not okay to stay not okay. In other words, we want to invite people, come as you are. It doesn't matter what you're going on. There's nothing you have to do to clean yourself up to come be a part of what God is doing here. But we want people to grow and to change. And so the key word in all of that is change. And you know this. Change is the constant. Change is the thing that happens no matter what you want. And if you don't like change, doesn't matter. Things change. Life changes. Everybody that is currently over a certain age that is using a smartphone knows that smartphones have not always existed, contrary to the opinion of those who are under the age of 20, who think they've always been a part of our world, right? There's change, and we have to adapt, and there's new technology. So we talk about that, because sometimes we're the architects of change. In other words, we're the ones who decide how we change. Sometimes it happens kind of to us, right, where change is imposed on us. But when we talk about this idea, well, why do we exist? Why do we exist as a church? We want to talk about, and I want to examine over the next 3 weeks, this idea of what does it look like to be changed? Because when we talk about change, when I talk about that, I'm not talking about most of the change that you would think, physically, or our skills or our job or things like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this. It's nothing more or less than changes that bring us closer to God and lead us to be more intimate and close followers of Jesus. That's the kind of change I'm talking about. So we want to be a church that allows people, that invites people, that come as you are, but be changed. We want people to be changed, every one of us, so that we're a little bit more like Jesus tomorrow than we were today, that we follow him a little bit better the next day than we did the day before. That's all it is. Doesn't matter where you are in the journey, just that we want people to be moving on the journey. Well, how do we do that? And this is what Phyllis said. We do this in our church, and I can't remember if I put a slide up for this. I don't know if I did. No. We want this church to be changed, and we do it through loving God, loving each other, and loving the world. So if we're going to be changed, if we're going to be new people, this is actually how Jesus told us to change. It's really easy metric in terms of remembering, because he says, look, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, you need to love God more and more and more all the time. Oh, by the way, he says, just like that, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you need to learn to love each other more and more and more and more and more. And then just before he left, he says, no, by the way, I want you to go teach everybody else how to do those two things, which is go love the world, make disciples. That's it. It's our whole mandate. The entire church can be boiled down to those commands. And so that's what we want to do. Honestly, if you want to be someone who is experiencing God in all the ways he wants you to experience him, all three of these are necessary. That's why we talk about them all here. And so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at these, especially in advance of our vision service. But more specifically, I want to say, what can we do in each of these areas? Just one thing we can do to help us move forward, because it can be a little overwhelming when someone says, I don't know how to do all those things. It's so big. I just want to look at a very specific thing in each one of these 3 areas over the next 3 weeks. So to help us in this, because we're going to look today at the first one, which is loving God, I want to look at a story from a well-known figure in the Bible. It's found in the Old Testament. It's the first part of the Bible. And you're very familiar with this guy. He's very, very famous. His name is David. Everybody heard of David? King David, right? But the story of David actually begins long before you ever meet David in the Bible. So if you know your history, if you don't, let's go over it a little bit. Israel is this new nation. They've come out of Egypt. They've been in this promised land now for a couple hundred years, and they're dissatisfied because they have no king. They're led by prophets of God and God himself, and they said, well, we don't really like that. We want to be like everybody else. We want a king. And even though this wasn't part of God's plan, he's like, it wasn't what I was going to do, but I'll let you have a king. And do you remember who he picked? A young man named Saul. That's right. So they picked Saul, who was actually pretty kingly looking, even though he came from a nothing family. He came from nowhere. He didn't really have any credentials, other than the fact that he was tall and good looking. And so he gets picked. And to his credit, Saul actually started out pretty well. He was a humble guy. He's like, I can't do this. I need God. And so he starts out pretty good, but then things start to go sideways pretty quickly. And he begins to not listen. He doesn't listen to the commands of God. He makes this crucial mistake. And he disobeys the direct command of God. And the mistakes were costly. Because Samuel, who was the prophet at the time, confronts Saul, and it didn't go well. Because Samuel told him this. He said, you've done a foolish thing. This is after he disobeyed this strategic commandment. Samuel said, you have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now, your kingdom, Saul, the things you're in charge of, what you're doing, will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Decision was made. Saul was through. Now, it didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen right away. But the Lord had spoken, and the line of Saul would end with Saul. Instead, what does he say? The next ruler of Israel is someone who is a man after God's own heart, a guy named David. You've all heard of David. You're probably familiar with this story. But have you ever thought through David's life in its entirety, in one sitting? Give me the quick sketch biography. He was the youngest of 8. 8 brothers, 7 brothers in him. He was the guy who got the grunt work because he was the youngest. That's what they made him do. But one day, he gets anointed by Samuel to be king. But nothing really changed. He got anointed, went back to the grunt work. But then, one day he decides, his father sends him, he takes food to his brothers in the army, and he sees Goliath. He challenged him to a battle, and he won. It's an amazing story. So he becomes a servant of the king, and eventually becomes a soldier in the king's army, not to mention the king's personal musician. So he's moving up in the world. He becomes best friends with the king's son, marries the king's daughter. I mean, this guy's life is on this upward trajectory. He got so popular and so successful that King Saul tried to kill him multiple times, chased him away, gave his wife to another guy. And so David then spent years living in the wilderness, surrounded by miscreants, vagabonds, being chased by Saul, running for his life. And they had good and bad times in the midst of all this. They won some battle with these guys, but once, if you remember the story, they were away and their families were kidnapped and all taken away. His own men wanted to stone him and kill David because they didn't think he was leading well. Another time he actually lived in the land of his enemies. He had to pretend to be insane, right, to drool down his beard and be crazy just because he was worried he was going to get killed. Saul, the king, eventually gets killed by the Philistines, and David is made king of the southern kingdom, just the southern part, the smaller part of Israel. And that lasts for about 7.5 years. But he's this amazing general. Eventually gets and leader. He becomes amazingly the king of the whole country. He does some amazing stuff. He conquered Jerusalem, which was supposed to be impregnable, and he did it by stopping up the river, let the river run, and then his men snuck in under the walls where the river used to go and He captures Jerusalem, makes it his capital city. He solidifies the kingdom. He conquers neighboring kingdoms. He becomes powerful. He had a core group of warriors called David's mighty men. It was amazing. He administered justice. He administered righteousness. And he was so enamored with God, he tried to bring the Ark of the Covenant, which was a symbol of God's presence, to Jerusalem. But in the process, he didn't follow God's laws, so it ended up with a man being struck dead. But then he eventually got it right, and then there was this massive celebration because they bring the Ark in. So excited that he danced with abandon in front of God. But then there was the time he stayed home when he shouldn't have. Instead of going off to war, he saw a woman, he lusted after her, he committed adultery, he got her pregnant, had the woman's husband killed through the mechanisms of war. Not a good day. But all was not lost. His son Solomon was born, his kingdom continued to flourish, except that he didn't pay a lot of attention to his kids, and his sons particularly. And one of them ended up raping one of his daughters, and then another brother killed that brother, and then that led to a rebellion, and he got chased out of the city and exiled. He led this rebellion again, almost worked, and David had to flee for his life. Ended up with this another son being killed by his own general. After this is all done, David's kind of reinvigorated as a king, but then he makes the mistake of getting so full of himself and so proud of his legacy that he decides to count all the people in the nation to see how amazing it is in direct contravention of God's intentions, and it resulted in a plague that killed thousands of people before he repented. But then just before the end of his life, David took millions of his own dollars and donated them to the plans and the building of this magnificent temple that he wanted to make for God, that God said, no, you don't get to do because you're a warrior king that has killed too many people, but I'll let your son do it. And then he died, having ruled Israel for 40 years. Now, that's the thumbnail sketch of a fascinating story. 1,000 years later, Paul, who wrote much of our New Testament, said this. And he's talking about the history of Israel. Look what he says. The people asked for a king. He gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled for 40 years. After removing Saul, he made David their king, and God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, and he will do everything I want him to do. Now, we read by that a little too quick. Here's why. Saul, David. Saul was a man chosen by God from nothing, and he knew it. He was given headship over a country, and he was a man who made mistakes, and he sinned. David was a man chosen by God from nothing, and he knew it. He was given headship over a country, a man who made mistakes and sinned. And if you read the story, the sins and mistakes of David were significantly greater than this. Last time this happened, I think we got one back, right? So how y'all doing? So it happened before. All right. If we have to have one, we'll have one. All right. We're going to hope that they catch up with us here. But I want to continue. All right. We're going to do a quick rewind because we kind of lost it for a second. So you had two people, right? Saul and David. They had the same background, the same beginning. They both came from nowhere, right? They came from tribes where God said, you're the one. They both said, I can't do this. I'm a nobody. Why on earth would God pick me? In both cases, God said, okay, you get to run the whole country. And then they both began to be kings, and they both made mistakes, big mistakes. David made horrendous mistakes. Saul made big mistakes. It's kind of like their lives were in parallel, and yet if you look at the end of the story, and I think we can get it here now. There you go. So you have these things going on. David's actually in a worse place in a lot of ways, and yet when you read the account of Scripture, Saul's a man judged by God and removed from kingship, and David is a man after God's own heart. Why? It had nothing to do with their behavior. You understand that? Because David made all kinds of massive mistakes. In fact, if you read the things, you're like, God should have stuck with Saul. Yeah, Saul had some issues, but he didn't do what David did. David had all kinds of ups and downs and horrible things that happened that he did. What's the difference? Why were their legacies so opposite? Why would Paul, 1,000 years later, when he's talking about this, make the distinction between Saul and David? Why is that? Do you know why? Because when it came to loving God, David was never satisfied with what he had, and he always wanted more. Always. His relationship with God was not intellectual or on the surface. It's what mattered to him more than anything else. I would say it this way. He pursued intimacy with God as a matter of priority in his life. Saul did not. We can see it in his decisions, in the things he did, but where you really notice it for David, because he made all those mistakes and committed all those sins, do you know where you notice it with David? In his times alone, in his prayer life, in his pursuit of God. And the cool thing about David is he wrote a lot of it down. And so we get to see the heart of David for what it was. And as I thought about this, I said, okay, if we want to be a people who change by learning to love God, what does that look like? I see 4 things here in David's life that I think are so helpful for us, because if we want to pursue God, if we want to pursue that kind of intimacy with God, what does that look like? What do we do? And I think this will be helpful to us. So let me go through all 4. I'm going to turn and go left. Here's the first thing, is he was relentless in his pursuit of God. Relentless. He never stopped pursuing God. For those of you that have been married or got married or are still married, how did you, and for you men who have been married for 40 years, how do you currently relentlessly pursue your spouse? I know what it looked like for us. Relentless pursuit means you never leave them alone, right? You're always calling them. Do you remember, those of you that are old, that you had a phone that had a really long cord so you could hold it and then walk around your kitchen and still talk, right? Do you remember how always have those conversations, right? Yes, you young people at the back, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But you're on the phone all the time. It's actually today, it's like texting someone, never leaving them alone. You're always talking, you're always communicating, you're always looking for excuses to be together. You're always looking for reasons to get together. And they're stupid, flimsy excuses. You know, one of our first dates, Yvonne said, I need help washing my car. No, she didn't. But she came, and that was first date. Right? When you pursue somebody, you're just looking for reasons. You won't stop. You're always looking for opportunities to have a conversation, to write a note, to send a text, to make a call, to be with somebody. What made David a cut above was that his heart was always pointed in that direction. He chose to praise God. He chose to see the world through the eyes of God. It's what he did. It was regular. It was ongoing. He was relentless in his pursuit of God. He was totally honest. He poured everything out he was feeling, positive, negative. He simply did not settle for going to the temple or going to the tabernacle and worshiping and singing a nice song and then going out for lunch. It wasn't enough. He was not content with feeling close to God sometimes. He said, no, I need more. And you can read it. It's filled. It goes all the way through the Psalms. You know these. As the deer pants for streams of water, my soul pants for you. This idea of I have to have it. This is more important to me than anything else. He says, praise the Lord, my soul. All my inmost being, praise his holy name. This is not casual. He's like, everything about me puts God first. I will praise you, Lord, with all my heart. I'm going to tell of your wonders. And we could go on and on and on. Do you see the passion in there and the desire? David simply couldn't help himself. And when the Ark of the Covenant came to Jerusalem, do you remember what he did? He, the king of the country, stripped down to his robe and just danced with abandon because he says, I don't care what people think. I don't care that if when I raise my hands, people are wondering what's going on. I don't care what it looks like because Jesus, God matters so much to me. I want to pursue him. I'll do whatever it takes. Do you understand that this is not an act? This was the result of him putting countless hours of quiet, one-on-one pursuit of God time in. You read him say this. He says, sing to him, sing praise to him, tell of his wonderful acts, glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord, seek his face always. Remember the wonders he's done, his miracles, and the judgments he's pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Israel, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. He could say these things because in his own life, in his own times, he said, God matters most. I will not let anything derail me from this. And when something derailed him, he got right back at it. He was relentless. To love God, to love Jesus more, and to grow in that is to pursue him relentlessly. How are you going to do that in 2023? I don't know what that looks like for you. But make a habit of praise, of thanks, of worship, of prayer, daily, frequently. Don't give up. When things are stale, lean in. When things get difficult, go after him. When things get cold, don't stop. Because he made intimacy with God a priority. Now, that led to the second thing, which is simply this. His times with God then, his pursuit of God in those times alone, that's what shaped his identity. One of the reasons that he was who he was because he let God change his identity. I mean, consider this. Consider how he became king. I don't know if you ever thought about the story of how he became king. He's in the fields watching sheep. In other words, you can just see dad talking to the kids. Hey, can you do it? No, I'm not doing it. Make him do it. No, I'm not going to do it. And it goes down the line until they get to David. He's the youngest. There's no one to point to. They're like, all right, David, this is yours. Go be with the sheep, right? Which meant being away from home, being in the open, being by himself for long stretches of time. And so he's out doing this like he did every day. And all of a sudden, some guy comes running up. He's sweaty. He's panting. And he's like, Samuel's here. And of course, David knows who that is. And he's asking for you. In fact, none of your brothers get to eat until you show up. So you got to come right now. I'll watch the sheep, you go, right? So David runs back, and all of a sudden, he gets there, and Samuel stands him up in front of his older brothers, which if you've ever had older brothers, and since there were 7 of them, some of them were significantly older than him, and says, oh, by the way, you're the next king of Israel. Yeah. Look at this. Lord said to Samuel, don't not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Have you ever thought what a slap in the face that is? Doesn't matter what he looks like. He's mine. Now, the Bible tells us he was handsome, but there was obviously something about him where God says, no, you're not seeing in him what you're seeing in everybody else, but that's okay because I picked him. This is how his whole kingship starts. And David never forgot that because even though he might have strayed a little bit, he always would come back to this idea that his identity was rooted not in what other people thought, but what God thought about him. Think about this. When he ran into Goliath, David's talking to Goliath, right? He's having this challenge. And he says to the Philistine, you come against me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day, the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Very bold. But then look what he says. This very day, I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by the sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands. This is not about me. This is about God. Do you know where that comes from? That kind of confidence? Spending time with God while you're watching the sheep. And God affirming, this is who you are. You are mine. When God spoke to him specifically through the prophet, David did not get proud. Think about this. David is now king, and God is using a prophet to speak directly to David, saying, look, I'm speaking to you as the Lord of the universe. David's response is to go sit before the Lord, and he said, who am I, sovereign Lord? What's my family? You have brought me this far. Like, this isn't about me. This isn't even what makes me feel good. It's not that you're talking to me and makes me so proud. I am who I am because God loved me and he chose me. And that kind of identity is only developed when you pursue time with God and intimacy. And yet every single person in this room, including me, struggles with their identity. And you wonder what other people are thinking and what they're going to say. And I can't pray out loud because someone might criticize me. I can't share because then I'm going to look bad. I won't say anything because I might look stupid. You know what? I got to be careful I do this because they're coming over to visit. And we worry about people. And sometimes we don't care about most people, but we care about some people. And so we let all these things shape our identity. We look at our past. Well, that's who I am because that's what I was like when I was a kid. And the entire time God is saying, no. Do you know who you are? You're mine. And the only way you will fully grasp that is in your times alone with him. I saw a really good quote this week from John Chrysostom. I don't know if you know him. He's a theologian from about 400 AD. He said this. Oh, I didn't even put it up here. I'm going to have to read it to you because it was so good. I came on late in the week after I'd done my slides. Here's what he said. If you knew how quickly people would forget about you after your death, you will not seek in your life to please anyone but God. And I thought, man, that's good. And I know that. You all know that's true. Because our identities need to be wrapped up in what God has said about us. If you want to lean in and get close to God this year, it's this idea of passionately, relentlessly pursuing him. Let him shape what you think about yourself. Because he says, look, I loved you so much that I left heaven for you. And I picked you. And I invited you into my family. I invited you to share the mission that I'm on. David pursued intimacy with God. It was a priority for him. And what it did is it led to a right view of God and a right view of himself. It elevated God, and in doing so, it made him humble, yet confident and grateful, not shame and guilt-ridden. But did another thing. Very interesting when you look at the life of David. His times with God also decided what he did. If we want to get closer to God, this is really key because what David did in all those activities that we read at the beginning, he tried to harmonize his life with God. He was always trying to bring them into alignment. So what was important to God was what was important to David. What burdened God burdened David. And when God said, go to the right, David, most of the time, went right. When he said, stop that in your life, he stopped. And even in the middle of the ups and downs, right, the sins, the different things, David was always looking to God when he stepped out of line. And he expected that he had to adjust to God, not that God would adjust to him. Listen to Paul's description again. After removing Saul, he made David the king, and God testified. Look at this. God testified. This isn't people. This is God saying, I found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. And then look what he says. He will do everything I want him to do. Now, think about that in relation to his life. Obviously, God didn't want him to commit adultery. God didn't want him to do the things that he did that were sinful. He didn't want them. Those weren't the things that God... So God's not saying he never missed the mark or he never made a mistake or he'd never sinned. That wasn't the issue. God says, look, David is the guy that will always listen and he will always come back to aligning himself with my priorities instead of his. Now, if you want a good 2023 where you're loving God, that means you all don't need more wisdom, you don't need more knowledge, you don't need more Bible, you all need more obedience, just like me. Because God says, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who's going to align their life with me. And when I tell them to do something, they just do it. That's what he's looking for. And when we do, oh man, it's amazing. And it's so good. And that's what David did. He had this desire to do what God wanted. You can actually, there's this really interesting relationship between love and obedience or love and action. Right? You know this, and you know this if you're in any kind of relationship, if you've ever been in a relationship with another person, whether it's a dating relationship, a friendship, being in a marriage, you can tell who I love by who I adjust my life for. Right? If I am willing to adjust my life, to rearrange my priorities, to change my calendar, to do things for someone else, you can tell that they matter and that I love them. Because the people that I don't care about, right? I had bosses at work that say, we need you to take your cell phone on vacation. I said, no, I'm not. I don't really care. You don't matter that much to me. But if a family member said, hey, you need to be available, okay. Same thing. I mean, you think about it. So when God says, look, I need you to align yourself with me. And you know how you find out what to do? In your quiet time. As you pray, as you seek God, God says, hey, I want you to do this. And he nudges you in this direction. Then he nudges you in this direction. And he kind of gives you a pointer in another direction. And he's saying, just adjust your life to me. And what's curious about that is the flip side is true. The more I grow in love for someone, the more I'll adjust my life to them. Right? It's kind of like a chicken and egg thing. They kind of go together. Right? The people I love, I adjust my life for. And the people I adjust my life for, I begin to love. And so if you're saying to me, look, I don't even know if I want to adjust my life to God. He's asking a lot. I don't really know about that. I'll tell you this. If you begin to listen to God and adjust your life for him, you will begin to love him more. It's just the way it works. If we're going to grow in our love for Jesus, we have to harmonize our life with him. It's like our worship team deciding they all wanted to sing their own notes instead of harmonizing with the piano and what Faith is doing. If we did that on a regular basis, you would all encourage me to stop having a worship team. Because it would sound horrible, right? If everybody says, I'm just going to do my thing. I'm going to sing it my way. Oh, I know you're doing it in the key of E, but I like the key of D. So you keep doing what you're going to do, and I'm just going to sing it in this key. I mean, it would be terrible. And yet, that's what we do in our lives all the time. We go and we talk to God and we pray, and God says, I want you to do this. And we're like, yeah, I know you like that key, but I'd rather live my life in this key, so I'm going to go over here and do this. It doesn't work. Well, there's one more thing that David did that I think is a great example for us, and it's simply this. His times with God then also led him to humility. David had a soul that could be reached with the truth. He was unafraid to admit his sins and his problems and confess them. Not always right away. Sometimes it took some time. When David committed adultery and murder, and he was finally confronted by Nathan. You remember the story? When Nathan tells this whole parable, and at the end, David's angry, and Nathan looks at him and says, you're that guy. Do you remember? It was like an arrow from God in the center of his heart. He was broken. And he ended up writing this beautiful Psalm 51 about repentance. And in it he says this, my sacrifice, oh God, the thing that matters to you is a broken and contrite heart that you will not despise. He wasn't arrogant. He didn't try and protect himself. He didn't have excuses. He didn't blame other people. Over and over, David would repent. He would make things right. He would return to God with complete humility, and he let other people see his brokenness and stop trying to hide. If you and I want to grow in our love for God this year, we have to understand that he's looking for men and women who have no locked closets, no secrets that they are unwilling to bring into the light. People who say, look, God, I can do that because my identity is secure. You've already said you love me. You've already said you're on my side. You've already sent your son to die for me. You don't have to prove anything else. And there's nothing coming out that's going to change that. So you know what? I'm in. We need to make pursuing intimacy with God a priority. And so this year, as you look at this whole idea of growing and changing in our love for God, and you're like, what does that look like? If you do only one thing, do this. Where you relentlessly pursue God. Go after him. And if your love for Jesus is struggling right now and it's a little bit cold, then I wonder if you have stopped making a priority of Jesus. Your time with Jesus. Maybe it's because you're holding on to the right to decide what you do instead of letting God decide. Maybe you're blocked because you're just refusing to let other people and God into that last little bit of your life that you kind of don't want anybody to know about. I don't know. You know what the world needs and what this town needs is not gifted men and women, but men and women who are broken and inwardly transformed by God. I haven't read the last part of this statement, by the way. This is what we started the service with. See what it says. This is Paul talking again. He says, the people asked for a king. They gave him Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. But after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. But then he says this, from this man's descendants, God has brought about to Israel the Savior, Jesus, as he promised. You and I have no idea what's at stake in our intimacy with God. There are things that can happen in this church and in this community that will happen long after we're gone, and they're being decided now. So let me ask you this. How badly do you want to see change? To see your relationships change? To experience God at a new level of intimacy? How badly do you desire to see Atlanta Road Alliance Church grow? To make a difference? To see people saved? It all begins with making intimacy with God a priority. We have talked here that one of the primary ways to do that is through prayer, and we're going to continue to give opportunity every week. I got to tell you, we've been doing this now for months. One of my favorite parts of every Sunday morning is between 9 and 9:45 when we gather in that room over there to pray. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's uplifting. I would encourage you to participate. Pray in your life groups. Pray in your ministries. Pray with your friends. Someone came up to me today and said, hey, by the way, I need the elders to pray over me after the service today. Do that. Do that with your friends. Do that all the time. Pursue him relentlessly. And when you do, let that decide who you are and what you do. And when you wander, come back quick. If you do that, this year will be different than any other year you've ever had.